Pleasure indeed to introduce my friend Geoffrey Corry. I've known Geoffrey for many, many years, particularly since Geoffrey's major role in developing Irish youth services when he was Secretary General of the National Youth Council of Ireland. And of course, we were fellow students in Trinity College. But Geoffrey has distinguished himself remarkably as a political dialogue facilitator, particularly with the Glen Cree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. And of course, he's very well known as a lecturer on the peace process in Maynooth University and Trinity College. Geoffrey recently received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Mediators Institute of Ireland for his development work in community and family mediation. So we're particularly privileged to have Geoffrey. I think he will be starting our seminar tonight. Secondly, it's a great privilege to introduce Dr. David Gallagher. David, of course, is the son of the wonderful Methodist witness, the Reverend Dr. Eric Gallagher, of whom we'll hear about tonight, who is so involved in the Feakle talks. But David, in his own right, is a very distinguished leader in the Methodist Church. Particularly, I've always admired his role in social policy and poverty issues, and particularly child poverty advocate. I have admired him greatly. I experienced his witness over many years, and I think it's good to see David and Geoffrey are still active members of the Methodist Church's Council for Social Responsibility, where over the years they have exercised a good influence, and particularly I admire David's brave contributions in the 1990s at conference and so on in terms of the peace process. So delighted to have David with his familial and his own personal contribution to make tonight. Reverend Dr. Harold Good needs no introduction from me. I've been thrilled to read his riveting book in good time. It's a riveting, as I say, read. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it to everybody because he recounts so much of what he witnessed as a courageous Christian, but also he brings to bear the other witnesses who worked with him to achieve the peace process and, of course, the wonderful decommissioning of arms, which is a unique episode, I think, in Irish history. And Harold had the trust of everybody to do that exercise with his good friend, Father Alec Reid. So we're very privileged to have our three speakers. Our overall theme is towards transformation of the world, and each of our speakers, as I have tried to briefly indicate, have been transformative in their thinking and have made extremely significant contributions over the years. So over to you, Geoffrey, and it's been a great pleasure to have you here tonight.
Okay, many thanks, Fergus. So what we're going to do is I prepared a few PowerPoint slides to give us a guide, because it gives us, I'm going to give you some diagrams and photos of a remarkable moment in peacemaking. And I've called this, I'd like to be able to call it, the blessed are the ceasefire makers. We pray every Sunday, or most Sundays, for blessed are the peacemakers, but peacemakers are different, comes in different varieties, and the ceasefire makers are really important in today's world to move out of violence and into peace. So I'm going to start loading up some slides here. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, so the topic tonight, as you know, is to see how the Feakle initiative fits into how we make peace. And here there is the challenge is, how do we get out of military solutions, which very much about where the army comes in and needs to defeat the enemy and creates a win-lose scenario, and try to shift military initiatives into finding political solutions to conflict. And they're much slower. It takes a good while, and diplomacy has a big challenge to be able to do that. And in more recent years, we are seeing the contribution being made by civil society leaders and also church leaders. But in the kind of violent phase, they can't often be involved officially, and they have to be unofficially involved in what we now call back channels. So effectively, Feakle was a back channel to try to see how to engage the militants and involve them in putting down their arms and moving into a peaceful situation. So the context we're involved in is that Willie Whitelaw, when he came into Northern Ireland politics through direct rule, we are now calling that particular time as the first peace process, as opposed to the big peace process that started in the late 80s and moved on into the 90s. When his big initiative was to create the Sunningdale, out of the Sunningdale Conference, to create a government. And here, but the goal here was to create a centre ground between moderates, SDLP, the Alliance Party, and Brian Faulkner's Unionists. And the aim there was to see if by creating a middle ground, you could isolate the extremists on both sides. Well, it succeeded in going from early January through to May of 1972. But you probably know that in 74, there was, I beg your pardon, in May, the Loyalists brought together a strike which brought down the power-sharing government. And effectively, and there you see them all around the power-sharing table. On your left is Brian Faulkner, who was the chief minister, and on your right was Gerry Fitt, the deputy chief minister. And at the end was Kenneth Bloomfield, who is a rather famous civil servant. However, it crashed, and out of that came a political vacuum, and nobody quite knew what to do. The SDLP were really shattered and very depressed after that, and really almost wanted to leave politics. So when you get a political vacuum, the challenge is, how do you create the next political step? So I'm going to show you the background to the Feakle initiatives. Number one is the role that Frank Cooper played in building a British initiative to support ceasefire. Secondly, the emergence of an ecumenical Protestant leadership, and I'll introduce those eight church people who went to Feakle, which came out of the friendships that developed. The third was, well, you might be surprised, but there was hawks coming and emerging in the Republican movement who wanted to see how to move into politics. And the final one, very crucially, was this secret back channel. Well, the Feakle was itself a back channel, but there was what's called a Derry link, which took over from what the churchmen started. All of that created these ceasefires, initially for a few weeks over Christmas, then it got extended and on into discussions about a truce. And it lasted up till, say, September of 75. So much of the material, the resource material to create an understanding what happened at Feakle still resides in two books. The first one written by Stan Worrell and Eric, both of whom were in the Feakle talks. So they devoted a chapter in that, chapter 6, to a discussion of and some record of what happened. But a much deeper record was made by Dennis Cook. After Eric Gallagher died, Dennis was given the autobiographical, I have autographical down there, it should be biographical notes, which were quite extensive, that Eric Gallagher had developed. And he has a whole chapter devoted to the Feakle, where he publishes the speaker's notes that Eric had on the Tuesday morning of the session. So up to recently, that's what we had to go on. And in fact, many historians don't really know of the existence of particularly Dennis Cook's book of what happened. But more recently, we have learned more about the overall context, because people like Thomas Hennessy went to the National Archives when they were published 30 years later to see the actual record at governmental level, and also who did that was Stuart Aveyard, and he published this book. The name is No Solution. Funny enough, Mervyn Rees, when he published his own biography, he wanted to call it No Solution because there wasn't a solution, it was only direct rule, but the publisher wouldn't allow him to use that title. And Stuart, knowing that, he said, oh, well, I'm going to use that title for the book that I publish. And then more recently, Niall O'Doherty from Derry, who now is lectures in Galway, he had access to the back channel, the Derry link, particularly mediated by Brendan Duddy, and he had access to his memoirs as well as many interviews with him before he died, and that's an incredible record of what happened. So let's come to peace building number one. I'm saying peace building, and I'm describing it as a building block of building the peace. And Frank Cooper, who became the permanent undersecretary, in other words, the secretary of the NIO, when Willie Whitelaw came to create direct rule. Frank had experience in Cyprus and would have been involved in background talks with Archbishop Macarius. So he had some experience of a previous conflict. And so when Harold Wilson gets appointed or gets elected in March of 1974, while the power sharing was still there, towards the end, Wilson wanted to find other ways of running government in the event of a power sharing government collapsing. So Frank Cooper wrote this amazing paper, which he set out all the various options that could be considered. British withdrawal is obviously at the top of the list, which was Harold Wilson was quite interested in that, but he didn't get any political support within his cabinet, and certainly not from the military. But he quite favoured the independence or dominion status option, and he got the Foreign Office to explore that a lot further. Cooper, in the meantime, was most interested in seeing how, with Rees, who he knew quite well because he was in the Royal Air Force with him during the Second World War, they began to see, how do we engage the IRA and bring them into politics? And that's where almost you could call it, well, maybe it's going too far to call it a crusade, but he certainly put it as Cooper as his main option. In the end, there was a group, a Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, a ministerial cabinet subcommittee, but also a smaller group that Wilson got together, and they in the end they came down for a constitutional convention, and it was this private group in the background who were doing some of the work. Bernard Donoghue is in there, and he wrote a paper for Harold Wilson on British withdrawal. So it still was important, or still a big thing for Harold, but it just didn't go anywhere politically. So that political high level work in Northern Ireland office with Wilson, that was really crucial in creating the political architecture for a ceasefire. So let's move on to building block number 2. And we have this incredible grouping of clergy and one layman, Stanley Worrell. And they, if you look at the age range, they're all born in the 1910s. So by the time they got to 74, I mean, not 74 in their age, but 1974, they were now in their late 50s. And in case of Stanley Worrell and Eric Gallagher, they were in their early 60s. Stanley was retiring from being headmaster of Methody. And when I went through the biographies of these men, I discovered an amazing coincidence. Stanley was a conscientious objector. He came from England and served his time during the Second World War in the Yorkshire coal mines. Jack Weir from the Presbyterian Church, his parents were missionaries out in China, and he joined the Peace Pledge Union. And we'll come in and hear from the British Council of Churches, Arthur MacArthur came over, was supporting the Irish initiative. He was a conscientious objector himself and worked in the YMCA in France. So we have, and Arthur Butler was a chaplain in the war. So you have this definite passion for peace, a passion for not going for war, and that must have been an important incentive for an important set of values for them to have a go in their late 50s, early 60s, to see what they could do in terms of a ceasefire. Arthur MacArthur. It's described here, he was over 6 foot tall, very thin all his life, with a rugged lined face, but full of character. And he started out in the Presbyterian Church in England, and then was a key leader in forming the United Reformed Church. So these men all had wonderful relationship and political in the sense of organizational skills, and they were very important in building this ecumenical dimension to the churches in Ireland, and strengthening the Irish Council of Churches. And I understand there was a great camaraderie between Eric here and Jack Weir as they were involved in the interchurch business. So Eric was, and particularly he was invited to in 1971 to Dunblane to the British Council of Churches annual conference, and would have met up with Arthur MacArthur there. And rising from that, they felt they needed to do something to support the Irish churches, and so they formed this committee called the Irish Advisory Group, and involved Irish leaders, the ecumenical Irish Council of Churches people over in London, in the British Council of Churches office, which was in Euston, not Eaton Square. I worked there for 2 years, so I happen to know Harry Morton here when he became General Secretary. So Eric was creative as ever politically, and this is an example of one of the documents he produced to produce a consultative assembly. Some of those ideas might have been fed into the constitutional convention, but it was very different. Now we come to the Irish Council of Churches, and amazingly, in addition to the British churches, the European churches wanted to support the experience of responding to the troubles in Ireland, and the Dutch in particular came forward with money and support. and they out of that came the Dutch Northern Ireland Foundation, and certainly some of the money for Ralph Baxter, well, maybe not, but certainly some of the money to keep Irish Council of Churches going, and the purchase of the ICC house in Elmwood Avenue, I think it is, would have come from the European monies. And in 1974, they funded the second staff appointment, in which case it was taken up by Reverend Bill Arlo. And Bill was involved Church of Ireland, and he started out his ministry in East Belfast, in have I got the name, Ballymacarrad, and then came back to as rector of St. Donard. So he had built and got to know Andy Thierry in the Loyalist side, so one of the significant things that arose out of the Dutch development was that they ran workshops in Amsterdam for church people, and then they made this courageous initiative to bring Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries to a workshop or a series of workshops in Holland. And it was on the plane coming back from one of those that he was sitting beside, I believe it was Jimmy Drum. It's not specifically mentioned, but if it was, then Jimmy said to him, well, what are the churches? What are you doing, Bill Arlo, for the Troubles in Ireland? And he was really challenged by that remark. And as a result, he began to say, okay, and to open up a channel, a line of communication to the IRA, which Jimmy Drum developed. And that meant, in particular, to Rory O'Brady and to David O'Connell. And arising from that, they were very interested in that. So suddenly this unique opportunity opens up where the IRA group are actually wanting to meet Protestant clergy. Now, they didn't want to meet the Catholic clergy. It was the Protestants because they knew through William Arlo that they had contacts with the British government. So that's 1974, but there were some seeds developing earlier. And in particular, there was this initiative when Father Des Wilson invited Eric Gallagher to meet with Harold Wilson. I beg your pardon, that's a later development, to meet three provosts, Sean McStephane, Joe Cahill, and Rory O'Brady in Dundalk. And out of that came, he was asked to give a message to Harold Wilson. Maybe David Gallagher can tell us a bit more about that. Eric got to know Seamus Loughlin quite well. There were two other interesting developments since '74. Stanley Worrell was invited by the Community Relations Commission to come on to a group to link to the paramilitaries. And there was a major conference, I understand it was in Port Salin in Donegal, and he got to know a good few of the leaders. And then we have Bill Arlo's work in building the link with paramilitaries. So all of those came to build the link with provisionals. Now, what was happening inside the Provost, and I'm calling this peace building block number 3, because there was an emergence of what you might call the Doves. These were two Southerners, Rory O'Brady based in Roscommon and David O'Connell in Dublin. And they were wanting to see how does we move the Republican movement much more into politics. Now, these lads had been together on the border campaign. They had been imprisoned in the Curragh camp, so they'd got to know each other quite well. Over on the right-hand side, then we have the Hawks coming mainly from Belfast, Seamus Twomey, who at that point in August '74 had become Chief of Staff, and people like Kevin Mallon and J.B. O'Hagan, who were in prison. There was a big helicopter came along and took them out of prison. So they were on the run. Now, why were the provisionals interested in moving into politics? Well, I've given 5 factors here. One is simply fatigue of the war, and how it was affecting people after 3 or 4 years of tough fighting, particularly in Belfast. They were the lads were volunteers, and there was a sense in which how do you bring in another generation of young fellas into keeping the fight going. Secondly, the British Army were certainly making rapid inroads and picking up volunteers and imprisoning them. And there was also, of course, the internment of 1971, where they were still interned in prison without trial. Then there was a big Birmingham bomb. We're commemorating that only 3 or 4 days ago, the 50 years of that, and that certainly created resistance or growing disenchantment in the nationalist communities with the IRA. And overall, then, this is important, that the notion of a ceasefire suddenly becomes a popular idea, because it would give everyone a rest. It would and particularly if they could get the men out of internment, then there was a chance for the Republican movement to regroup and to reform and so on. And finally, there was British opinion, because the body bags were being brought back, or that they want the troops brought home. So all of those created a movement within the Republican movement for peace. Here is the destruction that the bombs went off in Birmingham. 21 people died and 182 were injured, and that had a huge impact at that time. So Feakle almost didn't happen. Had the proposal for Feakle not been planned already 2 or 3 months earlier, Birmingham bombs could well have scuppered the chance for the ceasefire discussions to be there. So what were the other types of preparations that took place? It's unclear, because there's no clear record of what was done. But when Ralph Baxter did a spotlight interview just before his death, it was back in 2019. He said, yes, we did have the support of Harold Wilson. He had secretly approved their mission to sound out the IRA's true intentions. He says, we had Harold Wilson's blessing, and we knew that because we had talked to him about what would happen if we met with the IRA. Now, that wouldn't have happened as strongly had it not been for Frank Cooper's support in the Northern Ireland office. And there are indications that he was definitely generating with the Feakle men what would be the message that they could bring from the British government to the IRA. Now, it's most important that this green box here says, what did the Feakle team see? And it seems like they were very clear about what they could do. And here I'll just read it out. The discussions would not be about the negotiations. So they closed down. They weren't going to be the negotiators, or be intermediaries between IRA and British government in terms of negotiating something. That is a political settlement. However, they saw their goal very specifically, an end to the bombing and to the violence. And so they put their energy into a single event to meet with the IRA and to see how they could encourage them to put the guns down so as to enable political discussions to happen. And they've very definitely said, political discussions, that's the job of the politicians. It's not our job as church leaders. And so they had a very clear view of what they wanted to achieve. So here we are, 50 years ago, almost precisely on Monday, the 9th of December and Tuesday, the 10th of December. Here's a picture of the Feakle Hotel. So it's not some big 2 or 3 story hotel. It's just like cottages or something. And Dennis Cook described it in the book, an ornately and traditionally furnished cottage style that sat on a hill overlooking the village. And it was nearly all on one floor, but there were these flights of stairs going up into rooms in the attic or in the roof area of the cottages. And it was in one of the, I don't know whether maybe whether it was this one over here, but that's where the actual discussions took place. And why Feakle? Well, the IRA people, they didn't want to go, say, to Holland. That was a possibility because the Dutch church is supporting it. There was too many security issues. So Ralph Baxter was a rector down in the Feakle area, and he knew this hotel, and it was he who went down and negotiated the arrangements for 3 days to have to be in there. So on the left-hand side is the delegation of 8 church people, 4 of the 4 senior church leaders, 2 senior church people from Britain, from London, British Council of Churches, and then 2 from the Irish Council of Churches. And over here, incredibly, we have, apart from Moira Drum, we have people from the Irish, from the Army Council of the IRA. Now, this was an incredible achievement that you could entice all of them to come into an event. And when they arrived, they came with wigs on them, and some with sunglasses, and so it was very hard to identify them. And Eric had met Seamus Loughlin before, so he could identify him, and Bill Arlo had met Daithí O'Connell before. So, but others, it was very hard to know who was who, and so it was only afterwards I think they probably discovered who was actually there. So what happened then? Well, Bishop Butler and Bill Arlo drive down in one car from Belfast. They're both Church of Ireland. And then in the second car, the kind of the ecumenical leaders, Jack Weir, Eric Gallagher, and Stanley Worrell, all of whom knew each other, together with Ralph Baxter. And then flying into Shannon Airport, very close by, was Morton and MacArthur, Arthur MacArthur, and God, I've forgotten his first name now. Harry. Thank you very much. Yeah. So it's in the evening, and gather it was a wet evening, and some of the IRA had arrived, but not all of them, and they invited them to have a drink at the bar, and suddenly discovered, oh, the IRA fellas, they were teetotalers. They didn't drink alcohol at all, and so that was a major surprise. They thought they would be boozers to a high degree. So the church people had their own little meeting that night, and then the rest of the IRA group came early that morning, with driven down to Feakle. So we're going to see that in the opening session. I'll speak a bit more about that. And then what happens is that the meeting gets broken up, and I'll come to that now in a minute. So unfortunately, this session in the morning, Tuesday morning, was the only real full session that they had together. So here on Tuesday morning, and thanks David Gallagher for giving a sight of the actual written notes that Eric Gallagher had to make his opening address. He might even be able to show them to you on screen in a live way. So it was Stanley who opens it. It's up the stairs in this little room. They're sitting around a table. Stanley is at the top of the table, and along one side is the churchmen, and on the other side are the IRA men. So Eric opens up and welcomes them, and setting out some of his key values, that violence is the antithesis of the gospel, that they are obviously not involved in any political party, but they love their land. We are Irish men and we love our land. And however, they have a strong message to convey, which is that violence is counterproductive and is producing a polarized society. And if ever Ireland is to be united, then it would have to be a matter of hearts and minds, and not to have the bomb threatening that life. And interestingly, he asked the question, what do you actually mean by British withdrawal? And that's, of course, a crucial big issue in these political discussions and further on, as to what was the IRA actually asking for. And we see some clarification as the discussions developed that day and in subsequent months. Eric firmly agreed, or firmly put forward, that it was a political solution that we needed. And how do we get off the hook? And had the provost got the key to getting off the hook? So that was a very stirring opening challenge from Eric, who knew some of them, but would have understood where provosts were coming from. So the second speaker was Rory O'Brody himself, and he, you can imagine, put forward the strong position: our only solution is British withdrawal. But interestingly, he qualified that by saying that it's if we could simply get a British statement of intent to withdraw. We're not asking for the Brits to or the British army to leave immediately, all in one day, but if we could have an intention, a declaration of that, well, then that would be sufficient to go towards a ceasefire. And if that wasn't coming, well, then they were left, IRA were left with no alternative but to keep the violence moving. Now, Rory O'Brody had done a lot of political work in producing what's called the Era Nua document, which talks about a federalist solution. And he saw Ulster being a federal province, and with its own Dáil, as he would say, or own parliament. Okay, then he was followed by Dr. Jack Weir, and he proposed this kind of mirror, used the metaphor of a mirror image, and said, okay, on one side, or one bit of that mirror, or maybe you're looking at it from your side of the mirror, we know that you distrust London and England, but you have a great attachment to this island of Ireland. Well, he said, on our side, we distrust Dublin and the South, but we have a great attachment to Ireland. But it's an attachment not just to one island, but it's an attachment to also the bigger island of Britain. And he challenged them. However, we have deep emotional depths in Protestantism, and British withdrawal would cut off these roots for us. So he was definitely showing how British identity was a crucial thing. So when they talk about British withdrawal, who are they talking about? Are they talking about themselves? So he made a passion plea to end the civil war that was taking place. However, so after that, there was a good open discussion, among them all a frank exchange of views. You can just imagine what that frank exchange was about. We don't have any record of what other people said. We don't have a record, say, of what Arthur MacArthur was saying or what Harry Morton was saying from the British side, or indeed from Bill Arlo. And then as we hit lunchtime, the word comes through from a tip-off from in Dublin Castle to the IRA group that the Gardaí were coming down from Dublin, and so four of them packed their bags. Particularly it was the four who had just been released from prison and were on the run, and so they went off at lunchtime, leaving only the other four there. So at what had happened was, in terms of the meeting, they broke up into separate groups to work through what they had heard from each other, and it was in those separate groups meeting in the afternoon that suddenly the guards arrived. Now, it was a pretty big force. Just look at it: 120 Gardaí and 60 armed special branch, and then outside was the Irish Army. So it was a pretty heavily what was the message that had gone up to Dublin Castle, and it's hard to know, but it's reckoned that when the local Gardaí saw all these Northern Ireland registered cars outside the hotel, they wondered what was going on, and that's why they sent the message up. But maybe was it Conor Cruiser Bryan? That's another rumor that went going around. Did he seem to, or he gave the orders for this strong force to come down, or was there some other leak coming from somewhere, maybe British intelligence services or not? But it had a huge impact on the four of them, and you can just imagine. I'm just going back to the picture of the four of them here. They're up in the top room of the clergy were up the stairs in that meeting room, whereas the remaining four IRA fellas were sitting around the far downstairs. So when the Gardaí come in, they say, where are they? And they said, oh, they're upstairs. So the Gardaí bound up the stairs and broke open the door, and the guns are in their hands, and suddenly they realize, or they wonder who they are, and they go around and ask for the names. So one person says, oh, I'm Bishop Butler, and I'm the Reverend Dr. Jack Weir, and I'm Reverend, and so on. And they suddenly realize, my goodness, who are you, or where are you? And they realize it's a church group, and they began to put their arms down. But they wanted to check out and verify that they were actually a bishop, or they were actually. So they asked for their phone numbers, and I think it was Bishop Butler said, well, I don't want my wife to be phoned. I'm here on a secret mission. I don't want them to be worried about this, and the others supported that. So they didn't follow through on that. So it was quite a kerfuffle. And but it didn't it did what it did mean. I'm just trying to find where's that anyway. Okay, sorry. So anyway, they got down to business again in the joint group, and out of the discussions that the church group had, the clergy or church men, since Stanley wasn't a clergyman, they put together these 5 principles or undertakings. Now, some of this we believe it was based on the discussion they had with Frank Cooper, but it was built or further developed out of the conversations they had. And this first statement, that Her Majesty's government has no political or territorial interests in Ireland beyond its obligations to Northern Ireland citizens. That's an incredibly rich statement, and it must have been kept in British archives or something, because it's very close. 20 years later, it emerges in discussions that Peter Brook had, and it says, the British government has no selfish, strategic, or economic interest in Northern Ireland. So it was very close to the language that had been developed here. Okay, so basically what happens is the IRA take those 5 undertakings or principles away as the basis for a ceasefire, and they bring that back to their Army Council for consideration. So it was an amazing occasion. And when we look at these 2 statements, Bishop Butler says, we were all most impressed by their attitude, with their fair-mindedness, and we're so pleased to find that they were taken seriously and deeply, that they were being taken seriously and deeply with conviction. And Billy McKee from Belfast, IRA, one of the original commanders of the Belfast Brigade, he says, I think they were expecting men coming in with trench coats and rifles over their shoulders and bayonets by their sides, but it wasn't like that. It was a very, very cordial meeting and very, very good. Now, for me, who's been involved in political dialogue over the years, to hear those human statements being made of each other is really quite profound, and it affirms the huge power and potential of political dialogue, that there's a humanizing effect as people sit and meet face to face and hear each other's concerns, that's a relational piece of work, which let's call it peacemaking, and which creates a huge building block for peace. Without that, you can't get things like ceasefires or political agreements, and so we need more of political dialogue, or people meeting face to face. So, however, when the churchmen went home, the BBC on the Thursday, so they went home Wednesday morning, and the BBC News spilled the beans, if you like. It was no longer secret; it was now public news. And for Bill Arlo, and Bill Arlo says he had to take harsh criticism from his own community for treating with the enemy, and he had to move house and was under police guard for some time. So the risk that these men took to meet with IRA was absolutely huge, and it was on the basis that it could be kept secret, but somehow or other it leaked out. And for Eric Gallagher, and we'll probably hear from David as to how the effect it had on his house and the phone calls. You can just imagine if this happened in today's world of social media, how it would be huge, the effect that it all would have. It had a big effect on Ralph Baxter, and he didn't attend the first church, the executive committee that met in January of the Irish Council of Churches, and he had decided to get up and get out, and he emigrated to Canada, and it was a huge effect on his family. And when Spotlight interviewed him, you could still see tears from his eyes as he talked about that moment. And his wife said, he has hardly talked about that moment ever, and now he's saying it to you. So you can just imagine the trauma and that he carried inside himself from that time. Now, amazingly, that was the unofficial track. Here is the official track, because on that Thursday, the 12th of December, 2 days after Feakle, Jack Weir was launching with the other 4 main church leaders the church campaign for peace. So this was a very difficult meeting for Jack Weir, because he'd been at Feakle, and now he had organized this whole campaign before Christmas. And so those there are the stickers that he had got going for cars. Let peace begin at Christmas. For God's sake, stop the killings. Think, pray, talk, peace. And so, unfortunately, the media um, were all on the Feakle story, and this official church campaign hardly got much press at all. And so I think the church leaders were very annoyed with the Feakle group, and of course some church leaders didn't like what happened at Feakle. And I better not say what the Methodist secretary said. Somebody else maybe can tell us what he said. Okay, so let me finish off by saying then that after Feakle, the delegation went to see Secretary of State Merlin Rees in London, and brought with them the news of the briefing on what they did. And they were waiting a response from the Army Council, IRA, but it didn't arrive until 12:30 that day, just before they left Belfast to travel to London. And this was their response. So I won't go into the detail at that for the moment, but they kept going the line of communication with Frank Cooper, and they had meetings in Belfast. But it out of the Feakle did come the ceasefire. So in this green box, you'll see that before Christmas they announced the temporary ceasefire, which ran until the 2nd of January, and then got renewed again to run into February, and February on into the summer. And so these were various meetings with Bill Arlo and Stanley Worrell and Jack Weir. They had with Frank Cooper to achieve particularly the release of internees in order to enable the ceasefire to happen. So let me well, there was obviously a huge big Ian Paisley called it Feakle, and protested and had a big row with Merlin Rees in London at a meeting on the 7th of January. Now, it ends, the Feakle initiative ends on the 3rd of January 1975. So that's only a few days after the New Year and after the announcement of the ceasefire. So the announcement from the group was they had no plans for further action. If they could do anything effective, well, they will look at it seriously. And then Bill Arlo said, the door is closed, but there is a bell on the door. So the question is, why did the Feakle group suddenly pull out at that stage? And it seems to be that Frank Cooper, that they knew about the other link. They may not have known much detail about it, but Frank Cooper was saying, look, we can only have one channel with the IRA. I'll just show you, and this is my last slide before we end, that there were 3 channels in place. There was the earlier channel of Dr. John O'Connell from Dublin. He was a TD who opened up a link with Harold Wilson, and then informing Ted Heath. And then we have the Feakle initiative that we've just been talking about. But in the background was developing this back channel to the IRA, led by it was MI6 who through Michael Oatley and earlier Frank Steele went to meet people in Derry, and well, they met many people, but it was through connection with Brendan Duddy, a businessman in Derry, that they created this extraordinary link, and out of that, so Frank Cooper and Michael Oatley must have taken the decision, let's just have one channel, because there's only one channel, we can control that and manage the information, and the lines of communication don't get blurred. And so maybe the clergy knew about that, and that's how they bowed out. But they didn't want to continue. They knew, I said at the beginning, it was a short, sharp intervention, and they were quite happy that they had served the task of getting a ceasefire. So whether they knew all about it at the beginning, or it was only heard from Frank Cooper afterwards, is very unclear from any records that we have. Just recently, journalist Peter Taylor, who discovered Brendan Duddy, he wrote this little paragraph or sentence in his recent book called The Chiffon, or maybe I got that wrong. He said Feakle was a politically convenient diversion that could later be used to mask the fact that the British, and not just the clergymen, were talking to the IRA. So that's created the view, did Frank Cooper deliberately create the church link as a cover for the back channel? So whether that was his strategic plan or not, I want to honor tonight the role that the churchmen played in taking the huge risk that they did in meeting with gunmen and trying to convince them to put down their arms. And in that sense, we have a lot to honor them, the brave work that they did and the politically strategic work that they did. And it stands out as a model for church intervention or civil society intervention in bringing about the end of violence. So they are, folks. I better
Thank you, Geoffrey. I think we've got time for an input from David and Harold. So I'm not sure who is going to be first in that.
I think David is coming.
David, yeah.
Okay, then I'll make a start. So thank you, Geoffrey. And I suppose tonight's theme is about a dialogue and engagement. And as we've already heard, that Feakle wasn't just a Methodist-only initiative, nor was it the first or the last by any means. Perhaps it was less an event, and that's not to diminish the importance or the effect on the individuals who were present in Feakle, but as part of a process of engagement. And I'm inclined to believe that the participants in Feakle would not have seen it as such, not to be a one-off. So therefore, marking 50 years as we are now is an opportunity to reflect on the course of that dialogue, its impact and its present state. The context, most of which Geoffrey has said, this was the third Methodist contact with the IRA. Harold can say a little bit more about his father's contact in 1958 in Dublin. Geoffrey mentioned my father and Father Des Wilson meeting a number of leading Republicans in 1971. And there will be others later on. The context of 1974 was the collapse of the power sharing executive, but the massive increase in violence as one of the worst years of violence. As far as the Methodist Church is concerned, the Northern Executive met in early September, as it normally does, and it was informed then by possibly the Secretary of Conference, probably the press secretary, that there had been some kind of contact with paramilitaries, but it was very unclear as to what that was. It also met on the 10th of December, and Eric Gallagher, amongst others, was not present. And those who were present, including the senior officials of the church, did not know at that time. So perhaps that is an indication of their immediate response to it when the news was cast. So as Geoffrey said, there was this church leaders a campaign that was just about to be launched. Bishop Edward Daly had been approached during the summer, but that initiative did not get off the ground. So in other words, there were murmurings and there were some kind of movement towards this kind of engagement. Let me be a bridge very briefly between Feakle of 1974 and to bring it up to date as much as possible. What was the immediate response? Well, there was the church statement from the president, but in truth, it was as much a knee-jerk reaction because these talks had got to be secret. Some talks can be private, but not necessarily secret. This was a secret gathering, so they weren't informed about it. And as I say, it was sort of stealing the thunder of the church leaders' initiative. So it was a knee-jerk reaction. And perhaps Feakle, as it happens, may have been a demonstration of church peacemaking that gave a degree of impetus to the church leaders' campaign. Geoffrey asked me about the response as far as our family is concerned. Well, that Sunday, then, as my father was the only one of the 8 who actually then had a congregation. So as each member of the congregation, many of whom would not necessarily agree with the politics of it, but they saw the morality side, and everyone shook him by the hand. So that was a very affirming occasion for him. I have here, as you can see, the handwritten notes at Feakle, but I also have still with me, and shortly to go to the Public Records Office, then names of people who wrote in or rang in the immediate aftermath, over 150 names, some of whom are here tonight, or their relatives are here tonight. And that's a part of the continuing story of Methodism and peacemaking. So that was very, very affirmative. One, I will mention a fellow student of mine came up to Deck 6 in the library in Queen's, and Rosemary Greenwood, as she was, she gave me permission. With GDPR, you've got to be very careful. But Rosemary came up to my side and just said, look, I want to say well done to your dad. And as a son and as an individual, that was a very, very affirming, and I still hold that. So that gives you the power of just a positive affirmation. So, as Geoffrey has said, then in the short term, there was the extension of the ceasefire, more or less to September 75. Rightly or wrongly, there was the back channel communication between the government and the IRA. So if I'm a bridge between in this chronological journey, let me fast forward now, although I will step back shortly, but let me fast forward to the 22nd of November, 1994, so 30 years ago. Queen's University, the Methodist chaplaincy, Henry Keyes was the chaplain, and this was the first official meeting of any church with Sinn Féin, with Gerry Adams. And his first question was, why has it taken you 25 years to meet with me? And our immediate response, David Cooper, Henry Keyes, Ken Robinson, Wesley Blair, myself, Harold, in the room. And our immediate response was, well, why has it taken you 25 years since Feakle to bring the ceasefire into place? But you know something? In truth, we could probably have said to him, and I'm using his phrase in another context, that we hadn't gone away, you know, because if you go back to 1982-83, the New Ireland Forum, Sidney Callaghan, then as convener of the Council of Social Welfare, took part in that, and he said he saw his role, interesting enough, as an interpreter. Various Methodists were also there as part of the Northern Consensus Group. And then very, very critically, I cannot express enough praise to those who had the courage to go to Clonard to meet with Gerry Adams in advance of the ceasefire. Sam Birch, Jim Ray, amongst others, Ken Newell from the Presbyterians, and others. And that had a very significant impact on the likes of Tom Hartley and Jim Gibney, and indeed Gerry Adams. And of course, 7th of April 1993, again before the ceasefire, Gordon Wilson's meeting with members of the Army Council. And with an Opsal hat, my father and another member of the Opsal Commission went into Maghaberry prison to meet with the Republican women prisoners, led by Mary Wright and Martina Anderson, who's probably better known, was part of the IRA delegation there. So there are indications of ongoing contact. Post-ceasefire, then Feakle literally wove its way in a number of contexts. 23rd of February 1996, after the collapse of the ceasefire, 4 of us from the Northern Executive met with Martin McGuinness in his Derry office, and Feakle was very much mentioned in that. University Road, March 1996, Jim Gibney's response to particularly an intervention from, and he's here tonight and has given me permission to say this, David Clements, in a plenary session, was startling as far as Jim Gibney was concerned. He did not appreciate until that point that the IRA could have inflicted the same kind of pain and hurt on people as they felt, as their community faced from the British, from the police, and from loyalists. It was really a shattering moment for him. And then a few months later, in Conway Mill, there was a get-together of senior Republicans, and a number of us were asked to contribute to that. Pat Doherty, as a leading Republican and possibly Army Council, I'm not 100% sure about that, was quoted as saying that was one of the most important meetings he'd ever been at. Jerry Reynolds, Father Jerry Reynolds, was there, and he inputted some of the thinking to Alec Reid, and then that goes to Gerry Adams. And at the end of it, someone came up to me and said, "Just want to let you know, my father was at Feakle as well. I think that was the son of Billy McKee." So Feakle directly has played its part in some of these. Towards the end game now, I'm going to finish up quite soon. Harold Good then has relayed his story of decommissioning, meeting senior, if unarmed, IRA, and the very last act, a military-style handover. That's all recorded in Harold's book, and he might want to say something about it. More recently, in the last number of years, various presidents, Billy Davison and Sam McGuffin in particular, have met with the national chairperson of Sinn Féin, Declan Kearney, who we've had on Zoom before, to discuss some of their policy documents. And then 2 presidents acting as individuals have engaged very publicly with Sinn Féin. Heather Morris on a number of occasions, uncomfortable conversations would be one, but going to the youth wing of Sinn Féin and addressing the keynote speech at that conference, and Lawrence Graham down in Dublin, Ardèche, speaking in part in Irish to them. So I conclude by, Johnson, you may want to pick this question up in a minute or two. Is the Feakle thread of dialogue robust and strong, or is it tired, worn, threadbare? What was the impact of this periodic, episodic dialogue, and what is its present state? So thank you, Johnson, and perhaps then we move to Harold.
All right, thank you, David. I want to be fairly brief, but can I just say on behalf of all of us, I'm sure somebody else will say it more officially, but can I just say how wonderful a presentation from both Geoffrey and David, bringing us down through the years and back up to date with those incredibly well recorded stories of that process, and the thread that runs right through the common thread that David talked about that links them all together. Thank you very much for the way you've done that. I think it's something which must be well recorded. I saw Robin Roddy somewhere in one of the pictures, and I'm sure Robin will be able to ensure that it's recorded and kept safe within our archives. You did make reference, David, at one point to maybe one of the first encounters between a Methodist and a Methodist representative and the Republican movement. It was in 1958 when my father was president, R.J. Good. A young police constable in his congregation in Enniskillen had been murdered. I think probably the first of the casualties of the RUC. And my father was greatly grieved, particularly because he had baptized this young man when he was a babe, and he was very close to the family. And he felt very upset about it, and he was very anxious about what he could see was happening within our province. And he wrote to the other church leaders, the Archbishop, the Church of Ireland Archbishop, the Cardinal, and the moderator of the Presbyterian Church. And he conveyed to them his concern for what was happening and his fear of what was on the horizon, and said within his letter, do not believe, or should we not, as leaders of our churches, come together and be seen together to speak and share our concern and maybe try in some way to challenge what is happening, but do it together and be seen to be doing it together. I have two of the replies that he got from the other three church leaders. He did tell me that all three of them were saying the same thing, but I just have two of the letters in which the other church leaders were saying, Mr. President, a very nice idea, but the time is not right. The time is not right. And it was some years later before the Ulster Television brought them together publicly in a Christmas program. Some of you may remember that. And that was the first time that they had publicly been seen together as Protestant and Catholic leaders. But the interesting thing is that I have a newspaper record of it, where my father went to the Portadown conference, Methodist conference in Portadown, and reported to the conference that he'd been to see the leadership of the Republican movement, it was called in those days. It didn't call the IRA, but he'd been to see the leadership of the Republican movement, and he reported about his conversation, pointing out that even if they were to achieve their objectives through violence, there would be very serious moral questions about the means by which they had achieved it. And he challenged them on that thing. The interesting thing is that there was no fallout. The roof didn't fall in on Thomas Street Methodist Church, and there was no fallout that I'm aware of, and certainly no record of it. And my father never spoke of having suffered any embarrassment or any attack, verbal or otherwise, as a result of that. So I just put that down as part of the history. Anyway, one or two things from the story of Feakle. I think the discovery on both sides that they were talking with human beings, fellow human beings, that the people who were representing the IRA were not monsters, and the impression that the representatives of the Republican movement had of churchmen was very positive. And I remember Harry Morton, who was one of the things. I remember Harry Morton telling us, what interesting conversations he had with, I think it was Rory O'Brien. He said we had read the same books and we were on the same page on a number of issues, quite apart from the political situation, just about other things that we shared in common. And they found each other's humanity. And that is something that struck me. And it's something I have discovered. And I know, David, you and I were part of that meeting with Martin McGuinness, which is one of the earliest meetings we had. And we discovered humanity. And that, for me, was something that I discovered in all of my meetings. And when I lived and traveled with senior Republicans during the decommissioning exercise, again, as we sat in the evenings and shared our friendship and shared our supper and shared our stories of our families and our children and our hopes and our dreams and our aspirations, again, we were being human with each other. And that is so critical in any engagement with your perceived enemy, to find that you're meeting in a different way with people who share many of the same hopes and dreams for themselves and their families. So that was very important. And that was, for me, again, repeated in the more recent engagement, well, quite a while ago, but it's historically it's more recent, with Martin McGuinness and Geoffrey Donaldson, where we had protracted meetings. Again, they being human with each other. Well, I wrote across here, just in conclusion, I wrote, what if we'd had these meetings much earlier? What if we had had, the opportunity to engage with each other across these divides, not just between IRA and church leaders, but between citizens in this community of ours, between people with different political aspirations and ambitions? What if perhaps we could have avoided these awful years of violence and murder and mayhem? And yet there are people who still are unsure and critical of such engagement. I mean, in my book, I've talked about the chapter that the journalists all headed for was the one when Martin met Geoffrey, and and then the Ulster Unionist Party were upset about it because they had been criticised for doing the same thing by the DUP. And I was tempted to say to them in one of those programs where I was being examined and criticised, I was tempted to say, well, what if the Ulster Unionists might have said, well, they gave us a bad time for doing this, but isn't it great that they then discovered the importance of doing this? And thank God that they did, and that they began then to discover the importance of engagement. So my hope would be that now people will no longer feel they have to meet in secret, as many of us did over the years, behind curtains and anonymously. That now people can begin to talk more openly, in not just here, but in other places of conflict. Maybe that's what we have to share with other places of conflict, that if you want to make peace, you have to sit and meet and talk and become human with each other. And my concern, I'll close with this. I sat this afternoon with a young minister of another denomination, which I'll not mention the name of the young minister or of his denomination, but he is going through a very difficult time because he is seeking to build bridges within his own community. He's seeking to do what we're talking about this evening at a very local level, low key compared to what we're talking about, but he is even having to consider his future in ministry, because of the way in which he is being criticized and misunderstood, doing what he believes is an imperative of the gospel. So we've come a long way, but we've further to go, and we must see how